Hey everybody, this is Alan over at UAV Coach and DronePilotGroundSchool.com. And in this video, we're going to be chatting with Mike and Al over at UAS-Fire.com. Welcome guys, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good, how you doing, Al?
I'm good. The reason that we are shooting this video is that I'm getting a lot of questions from police departments and from fire departments about integrating unmanned aerial systems into what they do. I think it's one thing to see a drone and to read articles about drones and maybe to make some selections regarding hardware and software, but I know that it's a little bit different for a police or fire department to integrate drones into the day-to-day versus a commercial operator who wants to buy a drone and start doing property marketing or mapping and modeling type work. So you guys are the experts. Why don't we start with a little bit of background about how UAS-Fire.com got started and how you guys both got into the drone industry?
Well, we actually both went into a doctoral program together a few years ago for security studies. And during the doctoral program, we both focused on civil security, and having experience as a volunteer firefighter and also with my family having been in the fire industry for over 40 years, it was natural for me to pursue the fire industry and to look at it that way. And since drones or unmanned aircraft systems were burgeoning technology, I thought it was very interesting to want to find out what do firefighters think about this technology. What are their perceptions? Is this a technology that is going to be worthwhile in an urban setting as compared to a rural setting? Will the volunteers look at it the same way the career will? And I wanted to do my research based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I also was Mike's counterpart in that same program, but I was a career police officer, retired after 25 years. I was a captain. I'm also an attorney, so one of the things that struck me as very interesting was the hobbyist exception, and the FAA pretty much just very cavalierly decided that local law enforcement was going to enforce it, and so my dissertation and my work was based on the policy and law interaction of the hobbyist exception. So while we were together working on our dissertations, we also got involved with another group, a research group, and we did operational UAS research, where we were involved in flying some of the first operations in the national airspace in New Jersey. So that's kind of where we got the background for the UAS stuff.
That's great. So when departments approach you guys, what are they looking to do with unmanned aerial systems? Like, what are the most common use cases?
Well, what I've discovered is that a lot of them really just don't know where to get started. The ones who know they're interested in having a UAS, they're just not sure, okay, well, what do we have to do? What are the rules? What are the regulations? What do we need? What kind of aircraft will work and what kind of aircraft won't work? So it's really it's an education. We're here basically to educate them on the entire process and make sure they're doing it properly, because as you've seen by a variety of YouTube videos, there's plenty of drone footage of fires going on, but it's the guy down the street who popped his drone up and is looking around, and the fire departments aren't allowed to use that legally, but they do appreciate it, because I've spoken to some of them and they said, yeah, the footage was great. But then they have to be educated and understand it is, but you've got to follow the right steps. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, it occurred to me pretty quickly that, all it takes is for one agency, fire or police, to screw this up and, to lose the public trust, so to speak. And the burdens of doing this professionally are a lot higher in public safety. So, I think our one of the things that drives us is we want to make sure that agencies, number one, do this right because it's the safe and the right way to do it. But we generally don't want to lose it for everybody else. We don't want to have the technology be delayed 2 or 3 years while individual states wrangle with, putting restrictions on fire and police.
Mm-hmm. Have to be careful. It can definitely go down a rabbit hole as far as local legislation versus federal legislation. That's a very hot topic right now. There's a lot of tension But I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's really important when you're talking about local implementation of UAS. You have to not only consider the Part 107 rules, but what's happening locally as well, either in a local city, municipality, or at a state level. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of evolution of local laws toward UAS over the next couple of years. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yep.
That's great. So it sounds like, from what you guys are telling me, one of the biggest challenges that departments face is just basic education. How to go about doing this the right way, what those basic steps are, kind of getting that 30,000-foot view of what it means to bring drones into a department. But assuming they have a good grasp of what they want to do, what are those next steps? And sort of what I'm getting at, Mike, when you and I talked a few weeks ago, you reminded me that a lot of departments are volunteer-based, they're undermanned, they're underfunded. I'm sure budget is absolutely a concern here. So how do you sort of transition from, okay, we've decided how we might want to bring unmanned aerial systems into this department? Like, how does that actually get done? What are those next steps that you see with the departments you guys work with?
Well, and in New Jersey, nearly 80% of the fire departments are volunteer. And they are, like you said, not only strapped financially, but they're strapped with manpower as well. So what we try to do is to help them understand that, yes, there is going to be a cost burden up first. And yes, there could be an impact on your manpower, but it doesn't have to be as drastic and as, I'll use the word, scary or unsure as they're thinking. And that's one of the things. We're advocates. We're advocates for this technology, and we're advocates for putting it in the hands of people who are going to use it responsibly and for the public safety and for public good. So one of the things we do is we talk about how to budget their money in order to get what they're looking for, and we help them understand, well, what do you need? What are your needs? What are your use cases? You know, we'll talk about their run sheets. Okay, how many calls do you have? How many are alarms? How many are working fires? How many are search and rescue? How many are hazmat? And that helps us to break down the type of unit that they're going to need, the type of equipment that would be on the unit, and also helps us understand their manpower issues. How many, what's your manpower? How many do you think are going to be using it? Because there are some departments out there who are getting their hands on these UAS, and they're training 3 people or 4 people maybe per shift, whereas other departments, you're lucky if you roll out 1 truck with 2 guys on board. Mm-hmm. So we have to talk about that. Yeah. We just sit down, we have a discussion.
I think that, like I said, I was a commanding officer in the police department, and budgeting was part of my responsibility. And you hear this mantra all the time: do more with less, do more with less. Well, the great thing about unmanned aircraft systems is they're a force multiplier. They do, in fact, allow you to do more with less.
Absolutely.
Right? So that's really, if we were to discuss that, if I were to speak to, hey, about this in the budget, you can cover a lot more ground with these, both in fire and law enforcement. So, it really, what it boils down to is you need someone like us to go in and speak to the town fathers and mothers, or whoever the governors are of the town, and kind of lay this out in a very persuasive and logical way, and then kind of show them where the dollars and cents are. And I think that that's something that we can do very well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. Can we walk through a few of those use cases and examples? I mean, I heard you mention hazmat, search and rescue, like actually, shooting fires. What are some of those use cases? And then how are you matching up hardware and software recommendations to those use cases? And just kind of where I'm coming from is on the commercial side of the industry, everybody seems to be buying DJI. There are these great, introductory professional level models. You get your 4K camera, your 3-axis gimbal. It allows you to do all this stuff. Obviously, as you go deeper into certain parts of the industry, you have to consider your cameras and your sensors a little bit more. So I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole as far as comparing and contrasting option A versus B versus C, but based on y'all's experience working with different departments, what kind of systems are people using, and what are some of those most popular use cases?
Well, in my research and also just talking to fire departments in general, there's really seems to be a handful of use cases that they're looking at. One, of course, is search and rescue, which is really big, whether it's fire or police. That's a big one. Also, hazardous material spill, being able to monitor the movement of the plume, maybe being able to put it at an angle where you can see what the placard is, so you're not sending guys in to see what it is, face to face. Now you can tell what the chemical spill is. So that's a big one. Pre-planning is actually very big too. When you see construction going on and you can see at the rooftop level what's going to be up on the roof, what kind of HVAC units, what type of scuttle holes or anything else that might be up there. Also for scene size up. Scene is, it's as soon as you get there, pop something up and get a good look around. Will there be access in all locations on all sides of the fire? Or maybe it's burning out of one side of the building and they can apply different practices and strategies to the other side of the building in order to keep the fire pushed forward. There's so much that could be done. We're also looking at it for just training in general, where you can fly over your training and then basically do an after-action review. Okay, this is where things were working good. This is where we need a little more work. So the use cases are definitely there. In terms, I'll tell you, the thing that a lot of fire departments are looking for, thermal imaging. Mm-hmm. That's the biggie. Thermal imaging, infrared, and of course, you have to consider the weight of the material or the weight of the sensor or the camera on the unit. But really, that seems to be the one they're looking for. I haven't gotten a lot of questions about any type of sensors to pick up actual chemical elements. Mm-hmm. I haven't gotten a lot of spectroscopy but I have gotten some radiometry. Okay. So that seems to be, yeah, and a lot of them are familiar with the DJI product and they lean towards that. But we cast a wide net when we talk about the different units that are available.
Of course. There's other use cases that go for law enforcement. It's a little more problematic because there's the privacy issues, right? Right. So so we're right now. This is such an exciting and new technology. We're in the phase where you have the early adopters getting involved. But one use case I can think of where we went to speak to an agency who is involved with Operation Lifesaver, right? So I think it's Lockheed Martin. Has the Indigo, right? It's Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin has the Indigo, and they use a proprietary radio signal finder to find people who are, for lack of a better word, pre-tagged. Mm-hmm. But there's a couple other use cases. The gist of the research that we were involved in, the operational research, was during Hurricane Katrina, one of the problems was that the comms went down. All the radio towers were down. So even if you had units to respond, how do you dispatch them? So one of the use cases is to put a persistent fixed wing asset up in the air and use it as an ad hoc repeater, ad hoc radio network. So that's one. The other issue that I can see law enforcement using and or maybe fire is this idea of using unmanned aircraft systems for true ground sense, meaning that if you have a commanding officer away from the scene, you put it up, the commanding officer at a remote location may have better ground sense and may have a better picture over all of the assets that they could bring in as opposed to the on-scene commander. So I think that might play well for fire. The truth of the matter is that we don't know where these applications are going. I mean, as we develop the technology, the applications will follow. So it's a very exciting time.
That's great. I love that you mentioned that last use case. I remember talking with a department, I think out of Wisconsin, somewhere in the Midwest. I think it was Wisconsin. And they were communicating with the city about using unmanned aerial systems to first develop a list of kind of high-profile infrastructure throughout the city. So that lens was, religious institutions like churches, schools, community-based organizations, important city buildings, and creating a database of aerial images that the department could use to train on to understand kind of the back alleys and the roof escapes, and just to really get a much stronger sense of what that particular location holds if there ever happens to be some sort of event that requires use of department there. So it's kind of playing off of what you just said, but I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about using UAS.
Absolutely, yeah. Egress and access is vital in those situations.
Yeah. So Walk me through what a few fire departments are doing, sort of as far as where they're at in the stage of deployment, right? Because you're getting people at the life cycle, all the way at the beginning to kind of full deployment. So the departments that you've worked with that are kind of fully deployed, like how does that work right now? I think you mentioned some departments have 3 people training on every shift. Sort of, can you give a specific example, maybe with not needing to name the actual department, but just kind of a behind the scenes look at how somebody you've worked with is actually using drones right now, kind of day to day.
Okay. Basically, what we have started off by doing is getting them from the ground up. So we're running them through a test prep program to make sure that they're to federal standards. And they're getting certified, and then we're walking them through how to maintain, how to do, the ground school, ground safety. We've developed several programs that help them basically go from cradle to grave, beginning to end. And again, I think the things I'm hearing the most are search and rescue right now. You don't really hear it used for single occupancy residents, single houses. You do see it for some of the larger, like a warehouse fire or a multiple apartment complex fire, something like that. But, those seem to be the strongest use cases. And it also seems to be where they're putting their training efforts. And we're helping them. We're helping them. You mentioned earlier about, okay, what would be the best pattern to fly? What would be the best way to take a look at this particular scenario? And you have to be concerned about your batteries. Mm-hmm. You have to be concerned about thermals. There's a lot of things you've got to think about when you're flying that unit. Mm-hmm. So.
I mean, some of the, we have some research that we're looking to try to move forward. The research, the target of the research is to do some thermal testing on different platforms to see how fire thermals impact these aircraft. Because quite frankly, at least in New Jersey, there really aren't that many agencies out there that are kind of publicly leading the way, so to speak. Regionally, we know of situations where these things have been, the UASs have been employed, but tethered. So I guess there's a product out there that's a tethered deployment, and they have, at least preliminarily from our conversations with people, they've been effective and they've worked.
And New York has been very successful with that.
So
FCN1.
Yeah. So honestly, we really are. We're not quite to the tipping point here where you have agencies that are coming online and making a public statement about, hey, we use this, because I think that the regulatory environment is still such that nobody really knows, right? Mm-hmm. So they seem to be more prevalent on the West Coast. I know my contacts out in Seattle, they were leading the way. To use unmanned aircraft systems.
There's a few smaller towns. There's in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and I think they're starting to take a closer look at it further in upstate New York a bit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you do see some press. You do see some quick little articles and things like that. But there hasn't been a whole lot of chest pounding, chest thumping. We're using drones. We're using drones. We're using drones. Mm-hmm. And
I mean, ideally, our company, we would love to find a use case and then make it a peer-reviewed article so we could, share the information as opposed to just, just not peer-reviewed, right? So,
right.
So
I think we'll reach that tipping point pretty soon, based on just what I'm getting a sense of as far as adoption goes. You mentioned regulatory landscape, and I kind of want to bring it back to that because. Departments, police and fire departments are in this unique position where they can choose, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but they can choose to operate under the Part 107 regulations, or they can get certified as a department and get a COA specific to that department. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, the last time I looked, there's any number of agencies, both fire and law enforcement, who have applied for 107 waivers. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, obviously, the main things under Part 107 waivers are, to be able to fly at night, to no line of sight. And the big one is to be able to fly over uninvolved people. So to contrast the 107 versus the COA, I do know of a use case of a law enforcement agency in South Jersey who has been at this from the beginning and have been kind of grinding through this through trial and error, and they went with a COA. I mean, early on when they reached out to us, I said, the COA is probably the way to go, because you can narrow it down geographically, and it's I think a more defined permission, or it's a more defined waiver. So they actually had to go out and geocode the areas that they were going to fly, but it's a large area. Mm-hmm. And they have the waivers worked in, because they do things like for the training program that we offer, they do take into account ground safety, and they do have people certified in ground safety. I can't speak for everywhere in the country. I believe it to be true, but in New Jersey, you have, if you have an object or you have a technique in law enforcement or government that you're employing, you must train for it, right? You must meet a professional standard. The case is called Popo versus Margate. Anyway, so it's like when I speak to police agents, I say, look at it this way. You may have an officer who's ridden a motorcycle for 10 years, but if that officer wants to be on the police motorcycle, they still have to go down to Florida to that 6-week course to get certified. Mm-hmm. Everything in public safety requires a higher level of certification, and the unmanned aircraft systems, they're no different. So, so I think that I don't really have a preference, right? I think a good agency who has established and vetted protocols, right, who do it right, can fly just fine on a Part 107. And they can fly just as well if they want to put the effort in to COA. I think that the real issue here is just doing it right.
I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah, let's kind of unpack that a little bit. So to those who aren't familiar yet with that certification process, 107 is relatively straightforward. I mean, the FAA laid out some bullet points. You pass a multiple choice test, and you can get quote unquote certified with a reasonable turnaround. I mean, most of our students are studying for 2 or 3 weeks to get that certificate. That doesn't necessarily mean you are a competent pilot. I mean, that's a whole separate discussion, but for all intents and purposes, you are certified, and then you apply for additional authorization if you want to fly in controlled airspace, if you need to fly at night, if you need to fly beyond visual line of sight, and that whole waiver process is kind of what we're talking about as far as regulatory changes that are going to happen over the next several months and certainly years, making that a little bit easier, clearer. I mean, those are still getting reviewed kind of on a case-by-case basis. Whereas with the COA, and again, I'm speaking outside my comfort zone here, but my understanding is that it's a lot more upfront paperwork. You have to send a snail mail letter to the appropriate person and then hear back, and then there's a kind of an online form that you have to fill out. There's not too much transparency in the process, but once you sort of get through that waiting period, isn't the idea that sort of you, as part of that paperwork, you're submitting all of your training protocols. So you're almost forced as a department to think through what that training is going to look like, and then you submit everything to the FAA and they sort of give you the thumbs up, and you're allowed like a little bit more, it's a little more flexibility, right? Like you define the area that you're going to be flying in, and you're sort of given kind of blanket authorization to fly in that area under certain parameters. Am I getting that right?
Well, like aviation, the thing we have to always go back to is that this is aviation, and aviation is a highly regulated endeavor, and it's highly risk adverse. So you're absolutely right. It really boils down to with the COA, you're establishing a track record and a relationship with the FAA, right? Because you do have to jump through many more hoops. There is much more, like you said, front-loaded stuff and front-ended stuff, and that's the reason why you kind of get a little bit more latitude in how you operate, because you're a known commodity, because you've gone through these hoops. I think the danger is that agencies may believe that because it's Part 107 and because they have this issue of self-certification floating around, that that somehow lesser. It isn't. I mean, it's aviation. You're still held to the same standards regardless. It's just a matter of whether or not, if something goes wrong, what do you have to pull out of your back pocket and say, I did this right. Again, like I said, to me, And I think for Mike, it all goes back to, hey, do it right the first time, whether you're Part 107, right? Actually go through the protocols, right? Not necessarily jumping through the regulatory hoops, but you really effectively are engaging with the same product.
Well, and what we do as a consulting company is we take a look at every single department and consider their particular situation. What type of airspace is near you? What type of activity are you going to be doing? We also have to think about the burden of developing a program under the COA where maybe they don't know. The fire department might not know how to develop a training program, a maintenance program, an operator program. If they're self-certifying, there might not be some familiarity with how to do that. So these are things we definitely take a look at. And again, I mentioned before, what if we're dealing with a rural department compared to an urban department or a suburban department, a career volunteer? There's so many variables to take a look at as to whether to go down the COA road or whether to go down the Part 107.
And there's another issue here, right? I mean, I think we tend to fixate on this idea of the regulatory compliance. But if you hurt somebody, you're going to be subject to tort claims. I mean, and public agencies have deep pockets and they're a target. I mean, never mind that. But what about loss of public confidence? I mean, there's so many things that could go wrong if you don't do it right. So I think that, I mean, everybody's right to focus on the regulatory stuff because that's the bare minimum you need to do. But the picture is so much bigger than that.
Yeah, I love that point. I can't tell you how many of our students I get into discussions with regarding the regulations and airspace authorization. And, the regulations are dragging me down. I can't push my business forward. But when you really start to unpack it, they haven't read their user manual of their Phantom 4 9 times, right? They don't fully understand what those fail-safes look like and the intelligent flight modes and what happens when you lose GPS and how to deal with electromagnetic interference and things that might not necessarily come up on a day-to-day basis. But when you're bringing a flying lawnmower up into the sky, you should probably be very well trained on. And regulations is one very small part of that. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, what's the mantra, right? The PIC is ultimately responsible. Period.
Absolutely. PIC is in pilot in command. Yeah, I completely agree. What do you guys, to kind of wrap things up, when you think about adoption of UAS within fire departments and law enforcement departments, what do you think the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years kind of looks like as far as adoption? What challenges do you think that these departments are going to continue to face? Are we going to see more adoption? Are we at the very beginning stages of this? I'm asking you 9 questions embedded into one, so I'll pass the mic your way and kind of just let you wax philosophical on the future of drones in departments.
What I do see, we do, as Al said before, the early adopters are there right now, and they're taking a look. And even just in the past year, I've seen more articles in a variety of trade magazines and on a variety of sites that are showing the fire departments are starting to look at this technology and they're starting to pick it up. When I did my research for the doctorate, a lot of the problem was perception. Perception is now, and that's because it was an unknown technology and people weren't sure. But you hear drone this and drone that, and you see it in the news and you see it online. People's perceptions are now starting to shift. And the fact that you kind of just said, a lot of people are just buying these drones, they're flying them and not knowing everything that they do. So there's a perception growing that, oh, well, this is easy to do. So people are at least willing to take a look at the technology closer, even if they later realize, oh, you know what, if I'm going to use this right, I better pay attention to all the details, read all the directions, and get some training. But I definitely see within 5 years, I think it's going to be a pretty significant tool for fire departments across the country.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is disruptive technology. Kodak was really hoping that the digital camera was just going to be a fad and go away.
That's right. Classic story.
So, this is not going away because you know what? It's a great technology. It has great applications. For me, I think, for law enforcement, transparency is going to be a big issue. In New Jersey, we've come close twice to having the legislature put abominable restrictions on the use by law enforcement, and the governor vetoed it twice. Again, we're one vote away from really losing all but the most basic applications of this. I'll say this. When we were doing that first flight in the national airspace, it was a pretty large bird. It was an Arcturus bird. It was fairly large, fixed wing. But I remember the morning we went out there to the flight operations, I saw a story about I forget which, I apologize to whoever it was, which research university where they had gotten 100 micro UASs to fly in synchronicity. And I went over to the operator of the Arcturus and I said, are we working on the train here when someone just invented the car? I think, I think that in the short term, hopefully the FAA will get things more streamlined to allow this to be employed intelligently. In the long term, I suspect as a cop that, you may see a day where an officer has a little micro drone in a pouch on his shoulder. When he's chasing, he just picks it out, flicks a switch, throws it up, and now you got the little bird chasing the bad guy. I mean, imagine the results there. Imagine the safety there. Imagine the force multiplication there. So hopefully that's where we'll end up. So that's kind of my take on it.
I love it. We're living in the future right now. One thing that I just wanted to touch on, because you mentioned it a little bit, but I think in our pre-call notes before we started recording, one of the things you mentioned that you guys do as part of your consulting services is advocacy and actually doing that community outreach, because it's not just about thinking internally and developing, the right training protocols and standard operating procedures and yada, yada, yada. You have to, as a department, communicate, right, with the local community. And I think drones are very sexy. They're very loud, right? And people sort of need to know how the department is using drones. So can you comment a little bit on that and kind of what you've seen departments do and maybe what you've done as far as some of that community outreach goes?
Well, I mean, the model we used was Seattle PD. And Seattle PD, I've been out there multiple times working on some stuff with law enforcement, and Seattle PD is a great PD. They're very technologically savvy. They're very open. They're as open a police department as you're going to find. And they put together this UAS program, but they didn't do the due diligence in advance and kind of the PR and the kind of teaching the public and the public education part of it. And there was a huge public outlash, and they had to back down the program. I believe it was for 9 months.
Oh, wow.
So, people are rightfully nervous. Mm-hmm. I gave a talk on ethics at NJCU, New Jersey City University. It was myself and a doctor from the Air Force Academy. And he talked about the ethics of the military drones, and I talked about the ethics of the civilian side. People kind of have a bad taste in their mouths, even the word drone, because of the military application. And I'm not here to say that that's good or bad, but you have to educate people as to why it's good. Mm-hmm. So that's our process. Our process is to come in first. And we sell the agency if that's what they want. We figure out what they want. We tell them if it's there's a need case for it. Then we basically sell it to the people who they answer to, the public. One thing I want to point out though that we do that I think is essential is we also do crisis planning. We also have a crisis information plan, right? So when something does go wrong, the agencies who take us upon as their providers, they have a plan ready. Like we try to leave nothing, to chance, because like I said, you still have a good program that has a bad day, and if you don't manage it correctly, you can have that problem. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and what we've also done is we've invited members of the OEM, emergency management, to come to a symposium, and we've spoken to them about the use of UAS, and I think several of them came in with one idea, and then once we got through talking to them, they stopped and thought a little bit more about this. Also, I've gone down to the Firemen's Convention down in Wildwood, New Jersey. And again, there's been a lot of either misconceptions or preconceived notions that I've had to just have a general, discussion. Hey, okay, have you considered this? Have you thought of that? What about this? And not just for sales, but just for understanding the education behind the technology, the training behind the technology. and tried to address fears, basically a lot of fears. And I've even talked to a school system that is looking at possibly incorporating drones into some of their STEM programs. And and that opened up a really nice discussion because they were unsure of exactly what to do and how to go about it.
I mean, one thing I want to say is that, when we speak to people, we're not new at this. We were part of a larger group that gave input to the regulatory process for the Part 107 regulations. And some of our recommendations were adopted. So, we've been on the ground floor of this regulation. I mean, there are people who've been at this a long time because, unmanned aircraft systems have been around for decades and decades. But in this current evolution, since the Reorganization Act of 2012, I mean, we've been on board with this. So, it helps to have people in your corner who have the credentials and have the actual experience. And I think that helps a lot when you do this education.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing in this industry. I think you've carved out a really nice niche for yourself and the consulting services that you provide. And frankly, there's a lot of different ways to use unmanned aerial systems. One of the areas that I am most bullish / excited about is the use of drones in law enforcement and fire departments. It's just every time I read one of these articles, I get really excited and I think about this amazing technology that we now have that really wasn't available a handful of years ago, not at scale. So thank you for taking the time to chat with me. Where can people find out more information about you? What's the best way to get in touch with you guys?
Well, we're UAS Fire Consulting LLC, and you can find us on the web at www.uas-fire.com. Or you could even go to a site that we're working on, actually a co-company. It's a Drone Flight Services, and it's droneflightUSA.com. So you can reach us through, and we have email links there and phone numbers, and feel free to call.
That's great.
I just want to say that we know you to be a leader in this field.
Absolutely.
And we're pretty jazzed that you had us on. So thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you guys. And hopefully we can get some departments to chat with you, because I think you have a lot of information at your disposal, and we're just at a stage right now in the industry where information needs to be shared and there needs to be more education, and I think we vibe very much on that level. So please keep doing a great job, and I look forward to connecting with you guys soon.
All right, Alan, thanks.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.